I went to UC Irvine, which is actually quite famous in terms of photo history too, because it was an object of study for, say, Lewis Bolt, like, new industrial parks near Newport Beach. But, for example, Irvine was a very famous example and what was considered a successful example of a master plan city. And that probably influenced me to kind of look at examples of master plan cities that were failures or that did not necessarily pan out like Irvine, but came from a similar time of time period, both in terms of social conditions and economic priorities. So I became immediately fascinated by California City when I found out about it, simply by the fact that this place was called California City, named after the state itself, and yet I had never heard of it until I started looking into it.
I'm excited to welcome Nori to the show. Welcome to the show, Nori.
Thank you so much.
I'm glad to have you today. You have a wonderful series that I've been looking into before this show, and I can't wait to ask you some questions because they're just absolutely fascinating. But before we get started, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so my name is Noritaka Minami. I am a visual artist working primarily in photography and video right now. I'm currently based in Chicago. I've been working actively with lens-based media since about 2009 or so. And my work is represented primarily with three major bodies of work. And a lot of it concerns with the built environment. I've dealt with the city of Tokyo, basically field development in the Mojave Desert, and I'm currently working on a project in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. I'm really interested in these phenomenons that exist in the urban environment that are often either forgotten or overlooked. But I believe that by using the camera, it provides insight in terms of what was envisioned for the future in the past. And I use photography to turn those sites into images to think about what it means for contemporary society and also for the future.
It's a fascinating perspective. It's the vision for the future in the past. It just sounds like it sounds like a circle, but it's a fascinating exploration. I'm curious. What got you into photography?
That's an interesting question because I've been thinking a lot about my own past recently. What I do in addition to my art practice is that I'm an educator, a faculty member at Loyola University Chicago. So I work a lot with students. And I've been thinking about my own past, especially my educational past, to think about where and when I learned what, and also where my values come from. So kind of going back to my own educational history, I went to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate from 2000 to 2004, which seems like a long time ago, but I had very vivid memories of my undergraduate experience as an art student. And what's kind of interesting and what may make my practice a bit different is that in terms of my undergraduate studies, I was an art major, art practice, but I focused primarily on painting and printmaking because UC Berkeley's art department didn't have a photo curriculum at the time. So in terms of, I think, both my outlook as an artist and also as an educator, a lot of it is informed by actually what I learned through painting and also my conversations with the painters who are teaching in the program.
Fascinating. So I'm kind of curious, but were you always an artist? Or did you kind of find that later? What made you think about art?
Yeah, I would say that I am interested in art, but I always have also have a sense of ambivalence towards just purely thinking about art. I think as somebody who grew up through Japanese culture in like say this like the 80s and the 90s too, Japanese culture is really a lot of it is so dependent on images. It's really image heavy and image based. So I think from a very young age, I was very much interested in this idea of communication through visual images and visuality. And even before I started studying art in a formal sense in college, I was very much interested in this idea of images and especially how do you use it to document and examine society or contemporary culture. So even when I was in high school or possibly middle school, I do remember when this now famous photo book came out called Tokyo Style, which is a pretty famous book. And I remember seeing that as a teenager, and it did leave a very vivid impression on me, even though I didn't really think about doing art at the time. That was one way of using photography to capture things that are really interesting at that moment in time.
So you didn't originally study photography, but you found your way to a camera. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, I think I've always been interested in photography since I was a kid and through high school too. And, like with many high school students, I took one or two photography classes. The only reason I didn't study photography again as an undergrad is for very practical reasons, in that they didn't have a photography curriculum at the time in the art department. I would have, certainly, because the way that the curriculum was set up was that they'll pretty much allowed you to explore all the mediums that were available within the department. It was one of those bizarre situations where there were photography classes in the architecture department and the School of Journalism. But not the art department. And I think the root of that you can kind of trace back decades in terms of the politics of art, where photography wasn't prioritized, at least within that department.
So this was something that was kind of concurrent to your education as an undergrad. When did it just kind of take over and become like a major part of what you were doing?
Photography?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I graduated from UC Berkeley in 2004, and then in 2008, I entered the MFA program at UC Irvine. So I transitioned from Northern California to Southern California. And what was also really interesting to me is that the program at UC Irvine was and still to this day is it might be a bit tricky. I think UC Berkeley's program has changed a lot, since for the last 10 years. I have to update my comments about it, and so has UC Irvine, but it was really different. This was 2008. I was 4 years removed from the undergraduate program at UC Berkeley, and it was almost like a 180-degree difference in terms of the outlook of the program, what it emphasized, and especially the attitude towards strategies of making art. Where I think especially at the time, around 2008, Berkeley was more based on object making, in the traditional sense of say paintings. And with Irvine, there was so much more emphasis in terms of theory and conceptualism. And if anything, painting wasn't as emphasized. If you actually, my portfolio for my application for UC Irvine was based on actually mixed media painting. So I got in submitting, essentially paintings. But um, I don't know if it's still the case, but they kind of try to steer you away a bit
Yeah.
in terms of in terms of like video, photography, performance, installation, etc. So that was a big turning point, in terms of both my personal life and my art practice, entering the program at Irvine.
Was there anybody that was, I know on the journey of becoming an artist, especially someone that works within this world, there's always seems to be a person that was influential or had a big impact on you, on someone. So I'm curious who that person might have been for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very thankful for my entire experience at Irvine. Like, I didn't know that much about the program going in, but it was really a good fit. And I can name so many people who influenced me during the 3 years that I was there. But the one person that I really do want to mention is Catherine Lord, the artist and writer. She was really influential in terms of, especially the development of the project on the Nakagin Capsule Tower from the very beginning, and very supportive of my endeavor. And I think that support was really important because when you're in graduate school, you have a lot of experiences, in terms of whether your project has is worthwhile or not. So I appreciated that support, and to this day, she's a great supporter of my work. So
how does she support you? Is it like always being available? What specifically, how specifically was she inspirational for you?
Well, I think, when you're working on your own, you're so absorbed in your own work. But at the same time, you also have to take into account how other people see it, the viewers or critics. And I think that was the part where it was validating for me that, not only that work, but my overall trajectory in terms of my practice, that, there's something there that interests people. Not necessarily everybody, but somebody. And of course, I have the utmost respect for her career and her work. So, that type of support, that support that comes from a person like that, I think is always going to be valuable and validating.
Yeah, it's almost like that first person that sees you, or like sees you as a maker is like usually important, and that understands kind of where you're going and can help you develop that. And it sounds like that's what she was for you.
Yeah, I think we got along from the very first day we met, and sometimes, you just get along with somebody. So I think that's really,
it's true.
I don't know why, but,
Yeah. Well, my next question is about, is research important to you when you're developing your projects, and talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, research is really important. I think going even back to my undergraduate years, I was really interested in how could research inform your visual production, where looking back at it, I was never interested in having a type of practice or production that was solely based on the studio of making work, always something outside of the studio should be informing what I was going to do. So again, kind of going to the the MFA program at UC Irvine, it was a really great fit for me because one thing that it did really emphasize is research, in terms of like whether it's like theoretical research, historical research, and how does that kind of like create a dialogue with not only your work, but the art field at large. So as we'll talk about it later today too. All my major bodies of work, the three major bodies of work, research is a really big component of it, in the sense that for me, I struggle to make any kind of visual images unless I have a clear sense of purpose. in that, if you were going to create a visual examination of a site, what is its significance? Where for me, it's not sufficient that the image is, simply aesthetically interesting or formally rigorous. Where as a type of departure or as an underpinning, what is the significance of that site, and how could you explore that through the visual language? And often the case with my work, the research and what I find through, a research of a site that informs the visual productions, kind of creates a roadmap and allows me to devise strategies specifically to that site.
My next question then is more about then what drives your interest? Why point your camera in those directions, and why study these things? Do you feel like your early upbringing or the way you were raised might influence some of the reason why you were going these directions, or do you just find things that are just interesting to you and you kind of go, you know what? So I'm curious, how much of that is informed by early you, or is it just pure interest?
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty open-minded in the sense that I don't see it necessarily productive for me if I predetermine everything beforehand in terms of my own practice or the particular trajectory of a project. So I try to be open-minded, and I'm also interested in, once you start a work, where it takes you, so that whatever you had in mind at the very beginning, that transforms and mutates as you work on something, that you're open for things to change. And I find that to be a really interesting process of making a work when you're fully invested. Also, I think, it's easiest for me to talk about the three big bodies of work because, I spent the most amount of time on those projects, working on it and thinking about it. And, the work has been already produced. But I think, all three sites, there are some personal connections into my own biography. And even, say, the project on Ho Chi Minh City in terms of the utility wires. I kind of look back at, again, the past, and strangely enough, I was taking pictures of utility wires back in high school and also use it in undergrad too. So even if it kind of departs your visual consciousness for a while, it had a strange way of coming back, something that I was already interested in years ago. And it's interesting because certain things do start to make sense over an extended period of time, why you're interested in something. And you may not know at that time, but there's always a possibility that it may make sense in the future.
Do you ever do that? I know you said you kind of started looking at your original, kind of educational background, but have you looked at them, taken a moment to kind of see that common thread? And I love that comparison to the utility wires. It's really interesting. I'm curious, do you do that?
Yeah, I do. The utility wires is one example. If you were to look at, my work at the Nakagin Capsule Tower, you can it looks a bit different, and I have the utmost respect for his work, but you can clearly see, at least for me, it makes sense, that the fact that I saw the book Tokyo Style back in the 90s, that interest kind of manifests itself in terms of my own interpretation and documentation of the capsules, the individual capsules, as well as other influences that I was looking at the time, around 2010, like Zoe Leonard's work and Maura Davies' work in New York. And in terms of the Cal City work too, it's a bit of an outlier because it's a monochromatic piece, and it was shot with like really high speed film, so it's very grainy. But as I was looking at that landscape, of course I want to document the thing as is. But in the back of my head too, I was thinking about abstract painting, as a type of like visual language or a type of reference, where this map or this idea of a city was projected onto the landscape, and the desert landscape being as a type of like presumed empty canvas. So that's the part where I think my interest in painting kind of came out too, the Cal City work. So
yeah,
there's all strange lineages.
Yeah, and I'm always curious. I'm so curious because a lot of times when you start to look at a body of work, and now that you have these great 3 series that we're going to take a look at later, you start to see these connecting lines, and I'm always curious how far that goes. Is it you talked about a book, and I talk to artists all the time, and they talk about their childhood, here and or what have you, and I'm always curious, kind of where these interests come from, because that a lot of times is what feeds our desire to pull the shutter button and or spend a long amount of time on something, or to look extensively at one particular place and explore it. It comes from something deep, and I'm always curious what that is. So, do you have any idea what if we went a little deeper? Mm-hmm. Where do you think that comes from? You're looking at space, you're looking at place, you're looking at sometimes long and forgotten spaces. I know that Capsule Tower is gotten torn down, and so it's no longer, now you have like a historical record. Am I correct? So it's like, it's just a fascinating, what draws you there?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Capsule Tower too, from the very beginning, the premise of the project was that the building was going to disappear.
Yeah.
So that was always the underlying premise of the act of taking photographic images. It's actually quite simple, and also kind of taps into like arguably, an fundamental aspect of photography, this ability to create visual records of the past, and that
like indexing,
you can make the argument that at least for a period of time that visual images or records will remain even after the thing itself disappears. So quite simple in terms of like the premise and the approach. But I think, as somebody who was born in Japan and spent my early life there, I'm very conscious of the history of post-war Japan and the economic miracle, and the fact that that building embodied certain aspirations towards the future, in terms of the nation, and was a product of the post-war and the economic miracle. And I think it's interesting to think about the fact, think about what became of that vision, 40 to 50 years removed from that moment in time, in terms of the conception of the building and its realization. What happened to that vision of the future, over that period of time? And also, what does it mean for both that state of the building and also its destruction in thinking about contemporary society? So I was certainly thinking about national history in that sense. And also, I think for me, as somebody being from Japan, but then spending most of my life in the United States, I think there is a part where when you have a certain amount of distance from something that you're interested in, you can also see it clearer, or at least from a different perspective from people who are there all the time.
I think this is a great opportunity to jump in and take a look at that one in particular. Let's start there. And the series is called 1972. And so we call it, we've been calling it Capsule Tower. But this is a great series to kind of start with.
Great. So this is an image of the facade, actually in the summer of 2022, right before. Actually, this is a summer. Sorry, my memory is a bit shoddy because of COVID. I think that's the case with many people where it just made a mess. So I traveled to Japan as COVID was still raging on. It still is, but there was still travel restrictions in place. But I was able to travel to Japan, and this was shot uh, in the November of 2021, I think, right before the building closed. So this was my last trip while the building was open to the residents and before the demolition commenced. It was finally demolished over the summer of 2022, and I was able to take 2 trips during the demolition as well. It was one of those unfortunate things where, you had been working on that particular building for over 10 years, and I was completely obsessed with the building and working on it almost single-mindedly. And yet, even though the premise was that the building was going to eventually be demolished, when that moment came in time, my ability to both visit the site and access the building was severely restricted. So in that sense, it was a bit unfortunate, bad timing.
In this particular image is a little face here. It kind of like someone looking out at you. It pops right out, and it's a fascinating image. And this is capsule building. What's the idea behind? What kind of research did you do on this one? What's its story?
Yeah. So this building was made by the architect Kishore Kurokawa as part of the metabolist movement that was active in Japan in the 1960s. So the building is built up out of 140 prefabricated capsule units that are attached to 2 concrete shafts or cores. So the idea was that, these capsules are all prefabricated at factory. They were then transported to Tokyo and attached to those concrete shafts. And the architect's argument was that these will be renewed every 20 to 30 years. So this idea of metabolism by Kurokawa was that architecture was going to be flexible, and that these capsules would the building would regenerate itself through the replacement of the capsules. Yeah, what I found really interesting as an object of photographic project is that, even though the premise of the building was that it was going to have this constant cycle of regeneration, this constant changes. After the building was completed in 1972, none of the capsules were ultimately replaced. That they all were a bit ultimately stayed in their same positions for the duration of the building's existence. So it was essentially static, at least with the exterior.
So the whole idea behind the inspiration of doing these capsules kind of it got lost long ago. And it just started to go from there. So were people living here it looks like people were here.
Yeah.
And so this was inhabited until it got taken down?
Yes. So in terms of like famous buildings and famous images too, I mean, needless to say, this was a very famous building in terms of like 20th century architecture. And even before I took a single photograph, there's been countless photographs of it in the media, especially the ones that were taken of the building immediately after its completion in 1972. Some misconceptions that existed of the building, especially when I began the project, is that things like it was a failed build, it was a failure as a building, or it was a ruin or a type of abandoned building. But none of those are necessarily true, in the sense that, from 2010, it was still very much like a building in use. The capsules were occupied. Even after the building opened, all the capsules were sold in the sense that this was a condominium. So every capsule was available for sale, and they were all sold to private owners. So on an economic level, it was very much a success as a building.
Why not keep it going? Why did they take it down eventually?
So this is a very famous very well-known aspect in terms of real estate in Tokyo. In Tokyo, the price or the value of the land is much more valuable than the building itself. So the land in which the Nakagin Capsule Tower stood is really a prime property. It is on the very edge of the Ginza district, which is a very high upscale neighborhood in Tokyo, but it is still facing right in front of the expressway at a very high visibility location. And also the land that's right across from the Capsule Tower, it had recently gone through redevelopment about 10 years before 2010. So it was a prime piece of real estate, and it made, in terms of like the way that economics work in Japan, it made all the sense to redevelop it. But that kind of sets aside what is the historical and cultural value of the building. Also, it had come to a point where a lot of the infrastructure of the building was starting to fail. Say, for example, the plumbing and the air conditioning, and there was also the issue of asbestos being used as a fireproofing, which was legal at the time, but was no longer legal. So it was encountering this question of like, how viable was it to continue to operate as like, say, a condominium building, and that it was in desperate need for major repairs.
I'm excited to see some more images here and see what you discovered.
Sure. So this capsule is actually the very first capsule that I visited in the summer of 2010. It's the unit B1004. This was a capsule that was in the most preserved state, in terms of like how the original capsule was designed by Kurokawa's firm. The position of the bed, most of the original side console unit is intact with the Sony TV. The TV's frame is original. The inside of the TV itself had been replaced. But the moment in which I entered this capsule for the first time, I was really struck by just the presence of this capsule, just this atmosphere. The fact that it was a type of futurity from the past.
It has it kind of reminds me of that Fifth Element movie, that little capsule that he was living in the Fifth Element, that movie itself. But it also has almost with the round window, it almost has a very nautic kind of feeling, like you're in a boat. So like I think that's interesting. What was it like, kind of walking around in there? Was it?
Well, the space itself was like very compressed, 10 square meters. In terms of total square footage. So it is a very small room. But I think there was something about the circular window, where, the original inspiration for the overall design of the interior, it could, it was most likely informed by the person who was in charge being really interested in sailing. He was an avid sailor, the person who was working under Kurokawa. And also, this overall, say, mechanical theme or technological theme, that this space was a machine for living. But it was really fascinating being in that space, like every single time I visited the building, because, it is a really compressed space, but it's as if it really accentuated all the sensorial experiences in terms of like, say, the light, the sound. This was in the middle of the city after all. Yeah, and just like it is in the middle of a city, but it was oddly very peaceful too. I feel like you have this like different kind of relationship to space than usual when the window is circular, and also the light comes in very differently too, compared to like say a rectangular window. Yeah. And of course, the space itself has this kind of strange connection to like say a pinhole camera, and yeah. So this idea of being inside a body of a camera on a fundamental level in terms of design, and also all the original units themselves had these like windows that were basically these curtains that were fan shaped, so that was kind of like a reference to a leaf shutter of a lens too. So there's a lot of interesting kind of connections to the idea of photography or the camera itself.
Yeah, it's almost like you're inside of a Browning, an old Browning camera. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's this would be premium in Paris. I can tell you that. This is, you said 10 square meters. You said that's perfect. That is Parisian. So it's fascinating. Continue, take us through.
Yeah, so this is one capsule. Here's another capsule that was more being used in terms of like maximizing the space or kind of going beyond the capacity of the space. So, what I was really interested in the capsule was this idea of like what happened to the original vision of the architect, in that, he had a very specific idea of how the spaces should be used. Not as like, say, a traditional home, but as a type of like urban base for businessmen.
Yeah.
And that, it's not supposed to replace a traditional home, but kind of function as a type of like a base or a second home in the city, but not necessarily have all the functions of a traditional home, like say, for example, kitchen, because the city itself will take care of those needs. So that was, basically the premise of the architect in 1972. And what I was interested in that, after 4 decades, starting in 2010, how were the space being used, after that, that flow of time or passage of time. So this was one instance in which I captured somebody who was living in this space full time, even though the space wasn't conceived as a type of full-time residence, and how the space was being used by that particular individual. So, in terms of both the photography and also the capsules in themselves, it's kind of working off of this idea in which it keeps on repeating, this based on this idea of seriality and mass production, that the capsules on a fundamental level they were all kind of designed the same way. But the individuality or the differences come from the users that, occupy the space. So, in terms of like both the state of the space and its arrangement, it's reflective of that particular user or resident. And it also becomes a type of a portrait of the space in the resident.
It's interesting. It's a fingerprint in a way. It's very interesting.
So this particular capsule at the time was going through extensive renovation. So one of the really fascinating thing about the capsule is that, it was associated with this idea of like futurity, that it was like a type of like a factory produced object based on both technology and the most modern materials, this idea of like tapping into machines, space age, etc. And even to this day, there is a type of myth that goes around this building, and specifically the capsules, in the sense that, it was a product of plastic or fiberglass, for example, that everything was like essentially industrial materials. When I visited the building a an architect, a famous LA architect named Neil Denari, also happened to visit the capsule at the same time. And when he visited it, he was quite shocked that so many of the interior components were made out of wood, the product of carpentry, because he had always assumed that, for example, the side console units were produced out of fiberglass. But the image he had of the building and also the type of knowledge that he had of the building was all impressions that were created through photographic images. So it's an interesting kind of like, again, a type of image of the building that was created through photographic images, especially the ones that were shot after the completion of the building in 1972, and a type of understanding or an image of the building itself, what it is versus the actual reality. So, even though, again, everybody assumes that, or has this conception, a lot of people have this conception that it was made out of, like, say, plastic or fiberglass. What it was in reality was that a lot of it was traditional materials, like, say, for wood or wooden panels, and that it was handmade, the product of carpentry. So, I mentioned the word mass production before too, and even though it is based on this idea of like mass production, that it's all based on like standardization of like both the parts and labor, because it was the work of carpentry by carpenters, you also start to notice like discrepancies with each capsule in terms of like how the corner was constructed, because they were all handmade, the sensibility of each carpenter. So again, it's an interesting space because it's full of these contradictions.
However, though, a lot of times the building materials were mass produced, like sheet wood and, the materials in order to kind of make homes. You could buy those in bulk. You would just need someone to kind of assemble it. So that does make sense. It's kind of like the whole IKEA model, flat packing and buying, that kind of stuff. So I think that's interesting for sure.
I think this kind of like tension plays out where there's this one idea of what the building aspires to, in terms of both as a technological product, or this idea of futurity versus what ultimately was a determining factor of the factors of the construction, whether it was like materials and fabrications that were available at the time, or simply the budget.
As practical as the budget.
Because, the company that commissioned the building wasn't necessarily the biggest real estate firm. So a lot of it was determined by the scope of the project, specifically the funding that was available and kind of working with the client on Kurokawa's part. Well, this is an image of the building in the summer of 2022, right at the very end of the demolition process, where all 140 capsules that were attached to the two concrete cores had been removed, and you see the base of the two concrete cores on top of the artificial land base that was created on the second floor of the building. So, in a way, this was actually the end of the project itself when the building ceased to exist. And, the construction of these two concrete shafts was crucial to both the building's design, but also the premise of metabolist architecture in itself, where a lot of metabolist architecture was based on this idea of creating the permanent element, which would be like, say, the concrete shaft or the vertebrae of the body, and then you would have the interchangeable or the replaceable parts, which is represented in the form of capsules. So in a way, you can always make the argument that capsules were intended to be replaced or could be replaced, but there was always going to be the permanent element, which is the concrete cores. So when the concrete core is destroyed, the building itself is destroyed in terms of its logic or design.
What was that like for
know,
you,
I think,
seeing it like this? You know, you had spent some time there. So what was it like for you?
well, I think, I mean, in real time, I just really wish I could have spent more time during the final months as the capsules were being removed and the building was being demolished. It was
Yeah.
quite an incredible sight seeing a capsule removed, then being crushed by the demolition firm. You know,
Yeah.
like a capsule, in crushing a capsule, it would only take like say a few minutes to finish the process. So in some ways, the sense of pathos is kind of amazing.
No, yeah.
Also, it's like you work on a project for more than 10 years, and you always know that. I mean, at least I always knew what the end game was in many ways. The premise of the project and where it ends and when it ends. But I do think, like when you encounter it in person, I think a lot of emotions do go through. Um, and also, there was this profound kind of understanding internally about the status of change with my photographic images, in the sense that
Yeah.
it shifted to some images of something that no longer existed. So it's like
Yeah.
encountering this new reality and significance of the work, even though I knew that would eventually come.
It probably would have been surreal for me, just kind of spend that kind of time somewhere and that kind of studying there. It's, when you move out of a first home or somewhere you spent a lot of time, it's almost like you're leaving a friend behind, And so I was kind of curious if it was kind of like that for you. You were like, this chapter's done.
Yeah, well, a significant amount of time was spent on it. A lot of like
Yeah.
emotional investment, physical investment, energy, money, all the
Yeah.
practical things that kind of go into working on something like this.
Yeah. Did you get to know people that lived there? Go ahead.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Because like a major component of a project like this, or is about how do you gain access to the space.
Yeah.
It was an operating condominium building, apartment building, and all the capsules are private spaces that belong to
Yeah.
individuals. So it's about kind of navigating the issue of like how do you gain access to a space and also receive
Yeah.
the permission to photograph those spaces. So
Yeah.
that's the part where in developing a project you have to be very patient and
Yeah.
also work on it little by little in terms of both building relationships and networks and accumulating the body of work over time. That it doesn't happen all of a
Yeah.
sudden, but it's again just like putting in the work little by little. And I made really great friends through this project. Even though that wasn't my intent at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And this project was only possible to the generosity of others. Again, in terms of like allowing me to photograph their spaces and giving me their time.
That's so true. And you weren't living here at all. You weren't living in Japan. You were still in California at the time?
Yeah,
So you're flying
like,
back and
I mean,
forth. You're flying back and forth to come to this this location. Am I right or am I?
so I worked on it from 2010 to 2022. So
Yeah.
over that stretch of time, I was based at 3 different locations within the United
Okay.
States. Like first in LA, and then Boston area, and then ultimately Chicago. So, it was like a lot of going back and forth whenever I could with my schedule, going to Tokyo. A lot of it was dictated by the academic calendar because, that's my job.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
whenever I did go to Tokyo, it kind of came to a point where, people were really generous in that they let me stay in their capsules. And, probably the longest I
Oh
stayed
wow.
at the building was close to probably 50 days.
Oh
Yeah.
wow. So you spent some real time
I
there.
mean, yeah, I always
Yeah.
kind of second guess myself and I kind of wish I could have done more.
Yeah.
But, when you're working on a project, it's very, at least for me, it's very intense process, like in my
Yeah.
head. So I get fixated on something, and just try to put all my energy into that instead of trying to do too many different things.
It's a singular focus. I've noticed a lot of artists have that. They have singular fascination. You were referencing one of our episodes on the Urbanaut with Jessica, and she has that same kind of focus, on something. And she goes, "I'm kind of obsessed with it." You know what I mean? I'm just curious about it, and so I photograph it, and it's really an interest of hers. And I can see that here. You have the same kind of thing. Is this the final image that you wanted to share of the series?
I believe so. Like this
Okay.
image, I try to compress within the single frame, like the overarching idea of the project too, in the sense like, what was this building in relation to the environment that was developed or constructed after that point?
Yeah.
So, it's much about the foreground as well as the background, meaning the city that
Yeah.
was built afterwards, and this essentially different visions and ambitions of architecture.
Okay. We can stop sharing, and then we'll transition to your the next body of work that you have. And I just have one question before we go there, though. Um, have you always been interested in architecture? Is it another one of your loves, or is it just something that interests you?
It's always something, I think for a long time, it's something that's really interested me. I
Yeah.
really should have gone to architecture school at Berkeley because they do have a architecture department. Like, I always
Yeah.
think that, I should have gone to I should have studied architecture in undergrad. So, it would have made me a better artist, meaning that
Yeah.
it actually taught me some lot of useful skills that I could use in art practice.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but,
It's
you know, when you're young, 18 to 22, you you don't really have this knowledge and experience to have that
yeah.
sense
Of
of
course.
urgency at that moment.
Yeah. Well, and it's so much of it is you're just kind of going through those early phases, of development, but it got you here, so I think that's interesting. It's funny you talk about that architecture and stuff. Architecture and photography are closely linked. A
Mhm.
lot of times, a person's experience in a building, their sight lines and stuff like that is very much thought out in the same way that a photographer looks at scenes and stuff like that. And so they're very closely linked. But the other thing is I also like one of my other favorite classes, and this is completely separate, is I like studying geology. Like in part
Mhm.
of it is because, I'm photographing the earth. I want to know what I'm looking
Mhm.
at, right? And so like, especially like rocks and land formations. And I love spending time out in nature. And so geology was kind of like that. And I could imagine for someone that's shooting a lot of architecture, studying architecture would be a great way to kind of understand what you're looking at, what's important, those sight lines. And the way you talked about that building sounded like you were an architect and that you had a passion for it. And so it's just something that draws your eye. It's fascinating. But it also kind of leads you to, we're going to California City next, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's
Yeah.
leading
Yeah.
us kind of this kind of look at development, this kind of look at our impact on land and our stuff like that. And so talk to me a little bit about California City and how you made yourself there and why you started to photograph that place.
Yeah, so the development of the work at California City really paralleled with the development of the project at Nakagin Capsule Tower. In that,
Oh yeah.
I was still based in Southern California, and kind of running parallel to the Nakagin Capsule Tower, which kind of came out of like say 1950s, 1960s. This idea of using architecture, urban planning to propose a vision of the future. I also became interested in of examples like that in the landscape of Southern California too, in the sense of like
Gotcha.
whether it was architecture, urban planning. And I went to UC Irvine, which is actually quite famous in terms of photo history too, because it was an object of study for, say, Lewis Falls, like new
Yeah.
industrial parks near Newport Beach. But for example, Irvine was a very famous example and what was considered a successful example of a master plan city, and that probably influenced me to kind of look at examples of master plan cities that were failures or that did not necessarily pan out like Irvine, but came from a similar time of time period, both in terms of social conditions and economic priorities. So I became immediately fascinated by California City when I found out about it, simply by the fact that this place was called California City, named after the state itself, and yet I had never heard of it until I started looking into it. So even with the name, it's quite ambitious and extraordinary. It kind of tells you about the ambition, like supposed ambition of the site itself.
Yeah.
California City came out of the idea of a developer named Nat Mendelsohn in the late 50s. And what he proposed was a new urban center for Southern California. And in terms of the square area of the so-called city itself, I think it's technically the third largest in the state of California. And what immediately drew me to California City was, it was accessible by car from like Long Beach, where I was living at the time, Long Beach, California, about, say 90-minute, 2-hour drive. But like many other people, like what I do first is like with that kind of places, I go on Google Earth and see what it looks like in terms of like the aerial view and the street view. And I was immediately struck by the fact that you go to this place and like the infrastructure in terms of like say the roadways, the streets are complete, and they all have names, these streets, and yeah, there's hardly any buildings on it, especially the second half of the city.
They had street names. What were what were the names? Or are they just normal American street names? It's just there you go. Yeah.
So if you go onto Google Maps, like all the streets are named, even the large swath of land where there's hardly any development. I was immediately drawn by the fact that not only do they have streets and names for the streets, so these are things that do exist, both physically and legally, but they were named after like say car manufacturers and car models at the time. In terms of like say Studebaker or Oldsmobile or companies that no longer exist, like defunct. But that reflects say certain things that existed at the time and also values. The idea of automobile. And also some of the streets are named after major universities, like say for example like Stanford or Harvard, Ivy League schools. So it's funny because like when you look at the landscape, they have to come up with like all these different names for these countless streets. And, it kind of starts getting pretty arbitrary, but you also see like, say again, like certain type of like, ambitions or ideology at play too, in terms of the naming of the streets. And as I looked further into this landscape in terms of research too, if you actually go to, the records with Kern County, all this landscape is also has been like divided into individual parcels. So even though you don't see that, in terms of like on a visual level, these invisible lines also exist, both in terms of like say on a legal level and as a type of private property.
Wow.
So there's like
Okay.
different layers of law.
That's insane. And they didn't build, this was built in the 50s, you said.
Yeah, the development started in the 50s and kind of stretched into the early 60s. And in terms of like say there were different kind of like pushes to sell this land through different developers over time, but it kind of fizzled out in the 1970s, both through like say lawsuits and government investigations. That it was essentially a fraudulent scheme.
And so just the scars in the land are left, just the plan.
They're not necessarily maintained. Many of the streets in this part of California City, which is towards the far end of the area. But when you disturb the desert landscape like that, the imprints do remain.
What were you thinking about when you first? This is a very high up shot. How did you do it with a drone? Or did you hire a helicopter? Or do you fly helicopters? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So when I first visited the site, like it was an interesting site. In the sense that you have this like large area with a lot of streets, a network of streets that you can kind of travel through with a car, and also names of streets too. It all shows up on the GPS, but you can't really kind of capture the how extensive it is in terms of like this landscape, the network of streets, and how overwhelming it is. Just the idea of like the fact that they try to develop a city essentially in the middle of nowhere in the upper Mojave Desert, and it's just still there, supposedly waiting for houses to be developed. So those realities didn't necessarily translate to like ground level shots. So the logical solution was to shoot it from the air. But this was around 2015, 2016 or so. So of course, drone photography wasn't as common at that time. And on top of that, I was pretty insistent on shooting with film. So these were shot with a medium format film with like very high speed black and white film. So it had to be done through helicopter.
Let me ask you this: when you were up there and you were looking down at it, what were you thinking? What did you see?
Oh, it looks great. It was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even when you're shooting with helicopter, of course I was doing it for the first time, and I think we went up with the helicopter at least twice. I have to thank my friend Josh Cho, who was serving as an assistant. Was a good sport about it. Basically we went up with like say 4 or 5 Fuji 690 cameras, and he was helping me handle the cameras in terms of reloading the film. It was a little manual process, but even when you're up in the air, you kind of figure things out by actually doing it instead of just simply taking a picture of something. So it took a while for me to figure out both like say which areas of this particular section of California City is like say really interesting as visual images, and also kind of think about like say the best height, meaning like the distance between like say the camera and the ground and the angles.
That's awesome. Take us through a couple of these.
Yeah.
Sure. The first thing, I'm not sure. There's in South America, I think they call it the Nazca lines. I think that's what it is. But there are these large lines that form like these figures in the land. And it is the first thing I thought of. I think that's what they're called. But I got to thinking, if these were still here 10,000 years from now, later humans would be looking back at this going, wow, this is great art. I wonder what they were thinking about in this time. it would not have any of the context that you have right there. Um,
Yeah,
it's there's something strange and magical about it, but you know, I don't know. Maybe I'm just looking too far into it, but I was just immediately transported. And so go ahead. You were going to add something.
yeah, it's all like scars that are left on the landscape,
Yeah.
and it's work again. It's kind of working off of research about the origins of California City as a type of like advertisement or a commodity, in the sense that a lot of the early advertising campaigns of California City, Nat Mendelsohn emphasized the abundance of water that will be available on this land, and so much of the development will be based on, like, say, recreation. There's this like a recurring use of water as a type of motif, in terms of both the rhetoric and the advertising, and yet that was greatly exaggerated. So in a sense, there is this like strange beauty to what was left behind, but also this like almost like horrific quality of this city as an idea in itself, in a sense that the very idea that one could develop such a major development when there's so little water to sustain it. A bit similar to kind of like this idea of Las Vegas or Phoenix too, but kind of thinking about it in retrospect.
Knowing what we know about, California in the last few years, it's as far as their water shortages and stuff like that, as far as the low levels in some of the bodies of water there, it's fascinating. So this was a real estate scam, is what you found out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of turned into. I mean, people have differing opinions about what Nathaniel Mendelsohn, the original developer, what he really believed in, or what he knew, or what was his intent. But in terms of the advertising practices, it was definitely became a point of contention and a legal issue, in the sense that a lot of it was greatly exaggerated in terms of, like, say, the returns of the investment and what was promised in terms of the land. So,
well, apparently there was going to be water parks and and swimming holes and all that stuff. That's but this is all that's left. I can also see what. Go ahead.
There is a section of the city where there is development in terms of, like, say, strip malls and what is called a Central Park, and to this day there is an artificial lake there. And when they opened it, they even had this like ceremony where they dropped from the helicopter water that was supposedly from the Central Park in New York City. So again, kind of like trying to associate California City to, like, say, great ambitions or ideals or ideas. But even with that developed part of California City, it's pretty minimal in terms of the overall land that constitutes California City, and it's kind of using water as a type of mirage, where
it is.
Yeah, it's a type of false promise.
The aesthetic that you were talking about earlier, it's got a very, very interesting aesthetic, and I kind of see that reference to the modern style of painting, or conceptual, like, abstract painting. And is that kind of aesthetically, when you look at these, is that how you edit these and make a selection? Was that what you were looking for?
Yeah, I was actually studying other examples of aerial photography and the history of aerial photography in preparation for this project. And one example that I did study as much as I can carefully was Michael Light, because he's somebody who uses a lot of aerial photography and focuses on Southern California or the American West. But what I realized after looking at his images is that I actually didn't necessarily want to follow that model, both in terms of, like, the lighting and the angle, in the sense that I did not want to make it dramatic at all. Like, I did not want the images to be dramatic, especially in terms of the angles and light. And I was really interested in making flat images. just like blunt, flat images, both in terms of its like quality on a formal level, and also as a type of like response that it could elicit, just flatness.
Oh, okay.
That, of course, it's a photographic image in the sense that it's produced through the use of a camera and on film, but it could also be, it also almost starts to visually function like a type of drawing or a map. Yeah, and like this photograph was shot on like high speed film, and it's intended to be shown at a very large scale, like a large format print, so that the quality of the film grain or the film, like the image itself, starts to kind of work with the nature of the landscape, meaning the desert landscape, the bluntness of the landscape, this like the harsh quality. And as the viewer kind of goes closer and closer to the work, the image itself starts to disintegrate.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Wow. Okay. And it's kind of like it's almost a metaphor for this this project. Wow.
The formal language used in this project is very different from 1972. The Nakagin Capsule Tower. Even though I was working on it at the same time, here you see like a closer up shot of like one part of the development where you do see some houses that were built, I think during that, most likely the 90s or early 2000s, when there was like another push to sell plots of land in the city. You can kind of see the sporadic maintenance of like, say, the infrastructure here in terms of like the asphalt on the roads, and it's being kind of eaten away by the desert again. The cul-de-sacs, which are quite ubiquitous, in terms of like the idea of the suburbs. I do have I don't have it on my with me today in terms of showing it, but even with this image, you can kind of see the houses that are built on this land, that it kind of follows like, say, certain kind of like processes or steps of like developing a large home, in the sense that the home follows a certain type of size. It has landscaping, in terms of like, say, trees, even though it's in the middle of the desert. One of it also has like, say, are built with like, say, pool, for example, too.
Yeah.
This is completely empty for the most part. You do see the cul-de-sacs here again, but as I mentioned earlier too, like all these lands are exist. They've already been divided into plots or parcels, so they are there for purchase. It's in this continuous state since it was constructed, where it's waiting to be built, and yet it's not clear if houses will ever be built on this site. So it's like frozen in time.
Yeah, it's the desert might just claim it back,
Eventually, possibly.
Eventually, and just come right back into the desert. I'm kind of curious. It seems like that era of dreaming of the future and putting together these future concepts. The big idea that doesn't happen seems to be the thing that connects both the Capsule Tower project and this one, and it just seems like you're onto something here. And is that what kind of fascinates you about this stuff? What is it about that intrigues you?
Yeah, I mean, both the Nakagin Capsule Tower and California City are from similar time periods. And this idea of like home is what I guess ties these two projects, where it's pretty different cultural context or social context, and also the landscape itself. But I think both projects are tied by this idea of like having or proposing a very specific vision of the future that ultimately didn't pan out or come to fruition. And yet, its legacies still remain on multiple levels. And I think in the terms of California City too, specifically, it was done during a time where the water shortages in California were becoming more pronounced in terms of climate change. So even though this is a product of the past, it's a recent past and it is still there. And I think it really serves as an important case study, both in terms of like, say, contemporary issues in terms of like urban planning and lifestyle choices or priorities in terms of like life, and also could serve as as a type of issues that we will confront more and more as we head into the future, in terms of like what is sustainable, what is necessary, what is possible and what is not possible in terms of like the specific landscape. That you cannot, force have expectations of a certain lifestyle in terms of modern or contemporary living when there are no resources available to sustain it, realistically speaking.
It's something to think about for sure. That is something to stew on for sure, considering our current climate and our issues that we have going on right now. I think you're picking projects and subjects that in your own way are extremely relevant to our time, but also they're very well done. It's like this series. I know you said there's some people that like it and some people that don't, but I just see the kind of the artist touch in this, which is quite different than indexing, and just taking photographs for record, And so I've got to tip my hat to you there. So it's well done, sir.
This is a bizarre photograph,
What's that?
This is a bizarre photograph because or even a site because it's in the middle of a desert and there's like hardly anything built on top of it, and yet the person who owns this property and built this property still feels the necessity to put like a fence around it to demarcate it.
Yeah.
And it's almost in in a perfect triangle, which is like very
graphic. Yeah.
So it's it's like a bizarre. It's like a bizarre site. To say, and the Nakagin Capsule Tower is also very bizarre. So it's like, there is something to be said about like taking like pictures of weird stuff that exists in reality. Yeah.
Well, and I like this idea. Well, it's not really, it's the exploration of the big idea. And there's so many people that have big ideas, but unless you bring everybody along with you, sometimes those ideas don't happen, And so like, it seems like in a lot of ways, the original architect have being replaceable capsules. No one came along and it just, the idea got forgotten and it just never got done. And with this one, it just seems like, well, I built it. If I build it, they will come idea. You know what I mean? The field of dreams. And it just, no one came and it just didn't happen. And so it's just, it speaks a lot to human nature. It speaks a lot to the big idea and the visionary, and it's interesting. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think both, Kurokawa in making the Nakagin Capsule Tower. I mean, Kurokawa made the Nakagin Capsule Tower in response to certain conditions that existed in the 1960s, in certain ideals and needs. And same with Mendelssohn, where the scheme was developed in relation to housing shortage in Southern California in the post-war, and also the people's desire to be homeowners, but were kind of squeezed out in terms of like LA and the valleys. But I think both projects are connected by the fact that the original premises or intents were also undermined by changing conditions. And I think that kind of speaks to the nature of history.
Yeah,
in the sense that, circumstances change.
it's so true. Let's talk about that next body of work. It's a current body in progress, correct? You're still working on it.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get it done by this summer if I get the chance to go to Ho Chi Minh City again. This project is one where it was really influenced by COVID in the sense that it probably should have been done years ago. But, the pandemic really interrupted both the workflow and my ability to travel to Vietnam. And also
Yeah.
the fact that it's actually in some ways very similar to the 1972 project on the capsules in that it literally does deal with something on the verge of disappearance and has mostly disappeared, especially after the start of the pandemic. So the project SGN deals with the utility poles that were originally constructed by the French as part of their colonial enterprise in developing the urban infrastructure and the industrial potential of Vietnam and specifically Saigon. So I was really interested in the fact that these remnants of French colonialism still existed very visibly in the urban landscape of Ho Chi Minh City. And on top of that, it was kind of being used in a really unexpected way, in the sense that everything kind of accumulated over time in terms of both the weathering of the utility poles themselves, which were really obsolete by this point, but also had physical marks or physical accumulation of everything that happened since the Vietnamese economy kind of transitioned to more of a market system. Sure.
Let's take a look. Yeah.
Yeah, I really focused on working on this project in the summer of 2019, where 2019, I took 3 separate trips to Vietnam to kind of get going with this particular research and project. And what's interesting looking at this particular image now is that this site no longer exists. Site as in SIGHT. Since 2019, this utility pole, after that point, it was removed. So you can no longer see this when you actually go to this intersection. But in 2019, this still remained in that, you see the French, the utility pole that was originally constructed by the French based on the steel lattice system. And, it was originally kind of intended to serve a specific type of purpose and probably had a capacity limit in terms of both electrical and telegram wires. It's a product. It started appearing in the landscape of Saigon around the turn of the century, possibly late 1890s, but definitely by the early 1900s. And you kind of see it up until the end of the French colonial regime in terms of using this particular type of design. But you see, in terms of all the wires that accumulated since the 1990s and especially the 2000s, in terms of since the economy transition from one that specifically focuses on socialism to something that's more integrated into the global market. So you see all the accumulation of say the fiber optics as both the economy and society changed in Vietnam. So it's quite an amazing sight, and I believe that many of these photographs, were taken. I knew that these utility poles were in the process of being removed from the city, but also it was kind of like the apex of the accumulation of wires. So it kind of reached both an end point and a maximum point in terms of its usage.
It looks dangerous. It looks like it's gonna fall at any point in time. But it almost seems like there's a tension pulling it out and holding it up, and there's a strangeness about it, almost like it's a techno tree, a technology type tree, and They're fascinating. And these are everywhere, is what you were saying?
Well, it used to be around the like you see it. I think it used to be the utility poles that were made by the French were everywhere in terms of like this urban center of Ho Chi Minh City, and
Yeah.
you would as like the Vietnamese economy experienced this like rapid accelerated growth in the early 2000s and 2010. I think more and more wires started to accumulate on these existing utility poles that kind of went beyond their original usage or intent, beyond their capacity.
Yeah.
But it also kind of follows a very similar thing that happened with many cities at the turn of the century, meaning from 1900s to 1800s to 1900s, in that, for example, New York, where eventually the utility poles has so many wires that it was considered both a danger and a blight. So in terms of this idea of modernization of Ho Chi Minh City to the global market, they're following a very similar thought process in terms of removing them, both in terms of like removing them as a blight and also modernizing the landscape in relation to the global market.
Yeah, it's true. I think a lot of this stuff goes underground, so you don't actually see it above ground anymore. Yeah. That's and it just seems like probably 90% of that's not even being used. It's just on top of each other. Or is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These utility poles that existed in this form, they kind of follow both this idea of like being functional and completely being functionless. But because how do you?
I'm just kidding.
How do you? How do you organize through this? Like what's just is frequently described as a rat's nest.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's true.
What I'm interested in is in this idea of like layering of history and the fact that this happened as a type of like physical representation of history from the development of the landscape as a type of like colonial holding to introduction of a capitalist and consumer-based society. And as these things disappear, like what is the significance of that disappearance and what follows? And with this one too, you can kind of see the layering of images in the sense that you see that old colonial infrastructure kind of being used in a new way or kind of reaching its end life, and also the type of advertisement in the background that kind of shows the shift in society. This is like another interesting image for me too, in that you see different phenomenons within the urban landscape, and this is very much towards like the center or the core of Ho Chi Minh City too. But you see, like essentially the merging of two different kind of like not only styles but states of construction or architecture. In the sense that in the background you see like a very more recent apartment complex, that's like very elegantly produced, probably quite costly to live in, and in the attached right on up next to it, you see essentially things that are a structure that is constructed out of corrugated metal.
It's like this piecemeal, type approach to a master plan type architecture. Yeah, it's a lot of contrast, a lot of tension here, for sure.
Yeah, you see kind of like these sites still that exist in terms of like Ho Chi Minh City, where if we were to use the idea of like say progress or development, like not everything is consistent or universal or linear. That you see these tensions play out in terms of like discrepancies, not say in terms of like say wealth, economic status, priorities. So you have phenomena like this too, where like the utility pole has been kind of incorporated into a private property. It's no longer on the street proper, but has been kind of like eaten up by, say the house, and also by the vegetation that kind of grows from the garden.
It almost seems like they did it on purpose.
Yeah.
We got to make this look a little bit better.
Yeah, it's never clear if it was done on purpose or it just happened by chance, but
Yeah.
it is interesting, and it's quite beautiful that it happened. So we have more sites like this too, where
the structure is they're modernizing, but on top of it's like the layering.
Yeah, it's like creating a Frankenstein in a way where they keep on adding to it, but there's always a limit.
When you're doing this, and when you started to notice these things, what was it that drew you to it? What was, you were just like, did you go to photograph and then you just noticed that I had a lot of these images, or were you just like, that's interesting? And what made you start to focus on this?
Well, I think it's certainly interesting on a visual level. Like,
Sure.
as a photographic image, I think it's something worthwhile to capture. I mean, to simply put, it's interesting that such a thing exists in the city, that, it's in front of you and it's visually dynamic. But I think kind of connecting it to the previous projects as well, or specifically maybe the Nakagin Capsule Tower, like, it's an embodiment of a society in change, or some like a society in the process of change. And it also kind of taps into the history of the landscape itself, like something that is obsolete and yet still exists in this moment in time. And,
Wow.
I've thought a lot about, what is the point of me taking photographs of these? But I do think that, it's worthwhile taking photographs of these sites because, again, it's on the verge of disappearance, and I think there is some significance to it on a historical level. And, utility poles is public infrastructure. It's not really in the realm of, like, say, architecture proper or per se. So I think, because it was such an ubiquitous part of everyday life, if you were living in that city, it becomes normal, and it could be something that's easily overlooked. And I think there's value in that too, in the sense that because it was such an ubiquitous part of the landscape, that it is worth taking images of before they disappear. And in many cases, these sites have disappeared.
Well, and you were talking about the shift of society that, joining the global market. And they also tell you a story of that transition and where they came from. And it's almost like, and in some ways, the coverings have come off, and you actually get to kind of see the bones of change. You get to see kind of that shifting, these new worlds starting to collide right in front of you. And you said they're disappearing naturally, because of the natural progress or the natural evolution of this type of infrastructure, like you were talking about in New York. And so you're getting to witness that same kind of evolution. And it seems that, like, when you look at these things, and I'm starting to see a connection here. You're looking at time at a grand scale, and you're noticing time more than just the immediate. You're looking at layering. You're looking at forgotten. You're looking at an original idea that didn't manifest, or like a 50-year time frame. And have you always been interested in kind of a larger perspective of time, that evolution, or have you looked at it like that before?
Well, I think it's like worthwhile to try to make work or images that are somewhat complicated, where it's not simply like a one-dimensional in terms of its content, or making something as a type of like, on a basic level, it's just aesthetically pleasing, or
Yeah.
or as a type of formal exercise where, if it is possible, I am interested in this idea of like, how do you compress time into a single frame and multiplicities of time? In that, I don't know if this is necessarily grand scale, but looking at, like, say, a site like this, it does try to kind of have a dialogue with, like, say, a span of a century, from the idea of French colonialism trying to exploit this particular land and its people for its agenda, to, say, the different regimes that control this land, from, like, say, the South Vietnamese government to the communist government, and then to the shift in terms of the governmental policies. That, how does this essentially a normal or ordinary or in a like insignificant place provide insight to the trajectory of this land over a course of a century, from colonialism to independence to civil war to now, rapid economic growth. So I think,
It's
it is, yeah,
all buried
it is,
there, and it's
yeah,
so when you give it that kind of context, it comes through 100%. And I think what I'm fascinated by is your consciousness of that layering, that being able to be conscious of it and paying attention to it, and to make an effort to use a camera to portray it. Well done.
yeah. The thing is this question of, like, even before making an image, like, you have this, like, one have the sense of observation, of seeing sights and interpreting the landscape, where
Yeah.
making the historical and political implications of things visible through the act of making an image, things that
Yeah.
are in some ways invisible. So I think that's where a lot of the work happens, or the part, at least for me, where it's kind of it really kind of determines whether a work is worthwhile or not.
Yeah. Yeah. It in the depth is there. You can feel your sense of research, your care for it. It's not just a utility pole. There's so much more buried in it.
It's still like a work in progress, so I am kind of thinking about it. I'm still thinking through it in terms of, like, why I'm doing it. What is this worth? So,
Yeah.
a lot of it is still to be determined, or, the way I'm talking about it, there is this sense of uncertainty. But I think that's a healthy thing. I think that
Of
you do
course.
need some self-doubt. You have to kind of question yourself, like,
Yeah. Well, and then also, like, well, they're fascinating to look at. They all seem to take their own shape, and it's almost like a strange, a lot of sculpture is taking on this very industrial look now, and it has that kind of multi-artist contribution to make these things. They don't even know they're being artists; they're being so practical. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's
yeah. What I'm really conscious of is, like, I don't necessarily want to just mindlessly replicate a colonial gaze through my act of photography. But I think one important thing is that, as I think about it, like, just looking at this image too, is that, it's a very basic thing where this site no longer exists. Like, this intersection has completely changed in the span of, like, say, 2 or 3 years. And again, I think that's the part, like, where it becomes a very important underpinning for this endeavor, where it's not simply an aesthetic exercise, but it's kind of committed to
yeah.
the importance of what's happening right now in the city.
They do have an air about them. And I think someone that would live there, they probably have never paid attention to them. They've probably been there the whole time, and so
Possibly.
yeah, and it's just a part of the visual landscape for them, and so for you, it's I think in some ways your approach to looking at the time, looking at the shifts and stuff like that, it's like you said, it's not a colonial gaze per se. It's an investigative. Am I using the right? Am I saying it right? I don't think so. I'm probably going to get picked on in the comments, but you can tell you're doing an investigation, and you have this consciousness of time that's manifesting itself, and it's really interesting. So when you think about your work, we haven't really talked about, we've talked about like the origin of the project, the inspiration, the visual images that you're looking at. How do you see these bodies of work making themselves into the world? Are you thinking books? Are you thinking installation? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's different impulses within me that do not necessarily kind of perfectly align with each other. Where I think there's a part of me, both in terms of like my interest in the physical presentation or the presence of painting, like say for example, like large scale paintings or even small paintings and how they're hung in the gallery, the space of a gallery, and also the fact that there's like when I went to grad school, it was kind of like the high point of like say fetishization of large scale printing, as exemplified by like, for example, the Dusseldorf, photographers. That was really popular at the time. So there is that part of me that still kind of lingers where I'm really interested in this question of like, how do you show photographic work as physical objects in a physical space as an installation, both in terms of like the scale of the works, whether it's like big or small, how they are kind of shown within an architectural space. So the design of the exhibition, the spacing of the works, those kind of issues, like how much wall space can a single print hold? I'm really interested in that question. I think a lot of that actually is influenced by painting. In my career, that happened after grad school was the fact that I started working at Harvard BES, or what was called BES at the time. And the person that I worked for was this British Manx photographer named Chris Kill. And Chris was really invested in photo books. Working for Chris, I essentially got a second education, like a type of education after grad school where he came from a background that was completely different from all the other artists I had met up to that point in time. And both his perspective of photography and, his approach was completely different from what I was exposed to in grad school and also in Southern California. So that's where I really kind of learned the idea of making photo books. And what I'm also focused on is that I've been working on a maquette of a photo book of the work that I'm making in Saigon. Like my daily schedule is like really, really busy because like I have the work as a faculty member at the university, and also at home I have a young child, that just turned 3, so that's a handful too. So whenever I've had time this fall, I've been working on a book, for the Saigon project. And it's also my hope that I can create a new edition of the work that I did in the Nakagin Capsule Tower, the 1972 project.
Yeah.
A book on that project was published in 2015, but that book only includes the work that I did up to, like, say, 2014 or so. So, needless to say, I continued to work on it up to 2022. So I think I'm very interested in the idea of creating a revised or updated publication on that project. And also, like my thoughts on book design has changed a lot since 2015. What I should do or what I want to do. So, it's also kind of based on this, like my basic desire that I want to do something different.
So you think about it in both forms. It sounds like the book is definitely important for you. You learn that language, but then also you also think about it in space. But it sounds like you're thinking about your images in space in a very kind of, you think about it differently. You're not just doing the white cube kind of approach. You're thinking about proportions and everything. It's wonderful. And so I just have one final question for you is this is the last question that I ask everybody. A lot of my audience are image makers. A lot of them are people that are trying to make their way as artists, maybe photographers in some ways. And I'm curious if you have any advice for people trying to be image makers today.
It just could be based on like image makers and kind of like this idea of creative life in general. But I think about the question a lot because I work with students, in my role as an educator. And I think it's just this importance of like constantly working or thinking, where I don't think there's necessarily one mode of doing something that kind of is integral to, say, one's practice. Like, when you're trying to develop a practice, it really constitutes like many different things, whether it's like, say, research, looking at things, traveling, taking notes, trial and error, failure, making the final object, responding to unforeseen circumstances. But I think the most important thing is just constantly working, whether it's just simply thinking or reading books. Because, developing art practice is really hard, needless to say. And, it's almost irrational, kind of going back to like what I started to do after I graduated undergrad, because, unless you come from like a trust fund family or you're a trust fund kid, it's extremely hard on an economic level to make a living, So
yeah,
what's absolutely necessary is that you it's really important to you and it's a passion, because if you don't have that, it's hard to get by, on a very practical level, because, it's hard to make a living just with our practice. But, in order to have a sustainable art practice, I think over time, you have to be really passionate about what you're doing in the larger picture, and also just constantly keep working at it, because I think once the engine stops, it's hard to get it going again. So, even if it's like, say, 30 minutes a day or a couple hours a day, or whenever you have time available, it's like, how are you kind of contributing to your practice? I think that's a big question and challenge.
I think that is wonderful insights and wonderful advice. And I just want to say thank you for your time today. It meant a lot. And I'm sure my audience loved it. So thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. And to everyone that's made it this far, thank you so much for joining us. And please consider liking, sharing, and commenting down below. It helps us with the algorithm. And as well as if you want to support programs like this, please consider becoming a member on our Patreon page at patreon.com. And as always, we'll see you next time.